in the chat. And I wanted to open by asking if everybody could just go around and share one story of a sense of community you experienced through a purely digital platform. So I think I want to frame today's discussion around how much our lives can be mediated by platforms that are within or beyond our control, but digital platforms that have mechanisms for control kind of built in. And I can start with my little story, which is I spent a summer working at a website called Instructables, which is, it kind of rose at the beginning of the maker movement. And it's this tutorial site where people log on and they make stuff. And they're really, like, I really admire that this site, they're very specific about trying to have kind of community that, they're very inclusive with their definition of maker. Like, one of the things that they have in their kind of makerspace lab area is they're very careful to have a test kitchen. And the founder was talking to me about this. It was like, makers, like people who make robots and stuff, they know they're makers, but a lot of people who make stuff all the time just kind of consider it like maintainership work or like women's work type of stuff. And like making in a kitchen is also making with a sewing machine is also making with wires is also making with code is also making. So I really admired that about that community, and also their comments policy, which is literally be nice. And as a user, you can flag a comment not as just spam or inappropriate, but as not nice to have it reviewed by a moderator. And that's the first time I ever felt like I had friends who, like, I never met other than through their online presence, because you get this sort of core of people who you kind of get windows into their lives because they post these step-by-step photo instructions for different stuff that they're making, and then they look at other people's and they comment and they show you that they made it too. And yeah, that's one community.
I can share next. Actually, Edgy is like the first time I had like community through a digital platform because because Edgy is completely distributed. So for a long time, like I only interacted with people either through Zoom, Slack, or GitHub. And there was like a time like after, like, and it's really crazy because it's really amazing when you have like just consistent interaction through all these mediums that like a year later when we had, when I was able to like attend an in-person meeting and like was meeting folks for the first time in person, but it just like, it didn't feel that way at all. It was just like, it felt like we had like known each other for so long already, but we're like, wait, I've never actually like given you a hug before. But Edgy just continues, you know, going strong, and then like continues to be like my community. Yeah, so that's my story.
For me, it is the Midwest 90s emo Facebook group that I am part of. And a few of us, like the main posters in the group, have branched off. And we've created our smaller group that's private. And we've become really good friends and have like, lately we've been having Zoom calls with like 20 of us. And I've met a few people in different cities now. So it's sort of cool knowing I have friends across the country from this group.
I can go next. I don't have a good, or I don't know. I mean, like, yeah, Edgy, I feel like is that for me, but when you said that, I didn't think of a good recent example. I thought of an old one, which is probably an early one for me, which then I was thinking about in the context of these readings. I was really into modding Morrowind. So I was an active member of a forum called Tamriel Rebuilt, which was all about people who wanted to like build this one mod, which was like rebuild the whole continent in Elder Scrolls game Morrowind, which just had one little island of it, sort of like a quixotic project that could like also was like maybe not possible in the constraints of the game engine at the time. I think they're still going. I actually just Googled. Still going. That mod is active if you want to play Morrowind, a game that came out when I was in high school. So like a good 15 years ago. Anyway, yeah, so I guess it was like I had been active in forums or like IRC and stuff like that before, but that was one of the first places where I really got to know other people. And kind of at a time where there weren't a lot of these like remote collaboration tools in the same way. So even the way I knew them is so different. And I think the way I'm lucky enough to know people I work with remotely now. And so I felt like I knew these people well because we just posted in forums together, you know, and you kind of got to know who they were from that. Maybe akin a little bit to like say what something awful was for folks. Yeah, and so I mean, I just sort of eventually stopped making mods. that's kind of how I stepped out of that community, which in hindsight feels a little sad.
I think that might leave me. Right on. I've had something actually in mind. With Liz Berry, I have been organizing this process of discussing this phenomenon of emergent, spontaneous civic hacking disaster responders. And I just published this piece yesterday that shares principles that we articulated for sort of crisis response, you know, network-centric crisis response. My own experience during Hurricane Irma, I wasn't in Miami, which is where I'm from and where I am now, but I was watching the storm, you know, as it emerged and headed right at us, and I set up a Slack. You know, for what I saw a whole bunch of people talking about how the storm was coming, but in different forums. And so, you know, I set up a Slack for people who wanted to prepare. And within a couple of days, there were like 700 or almost 1,000 people in it. And they were doing all kinds of things. And I felt responsible for this space that I'd set up. And so I was like working 18-hour days to just like manage all the things that all these people were doing. You know, a lot of which were actually like not very good ideas, all really well intentioned, but a lot of times people just like came up with something and they're like, let's get to work and let's, you know, put this data together. And it was just like, who did you talk to? Who said that was a good idea? You know, how, like, blah, blah, blah. And I just had a really challenging experience trying to organize this community in Slack. As fun as it was like coming together, like I had very few tools at my disposal for sorting through noise and for like evaluating the quality of different kinds of things that were going on. And it was only through connecting with other organizers who were experienced with this kind of community curation and network organizing that we got some measure of control by doing things like every channel should have a document that says what's happening in this channel, you know, at the top of the channel. And like, you know, it was like we had to actually figure out how to make it work. And so I sort of walked away being like, I would like to help others learn from our mistakes so that they can make more interesting mistakes. So.
That's really interesting. That's a great transition, actually, to I wanted to make sure everybody had a moment of community enabled by these types of platforms that they could kind of hold in their hearts as we talk about these articles, which are largely pretty negative about what it means to do moderation. And this is really, I mean, the topic is moderation in general in theory, but when I picked articles, I definitely focused on digital spaces and sort of power, control, responsibility, and what we owe to each other as participants. And I really thought it was very interesting, Greg, that you brought up the word responsibility so quickly. Do you still feel responsible to your community? I'm curious how you handled that too, like in terms of bringing on new moderators and such.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and I'm still. I mean, in the time, the way I felt responsible for the network that I convened, but also responsible to ensure that that network was accountable to members of the community. So I was spending a lot of my time going out and finding people who would never join our Slack and like talking to them and then bringing back that perspective into this platform, right? Like, which was not like must be a better way. Yeah, and that was partially why I wrote these principles was having. I didn't write the principles. I facilitated like these conversations, but having something on hand to be like, this is why we're going to go to the extra effort to hear from somebody before we put this out into the world. People just like, they're there in Slack and they're seeing everybody in Slack. And when I'm talking about like, why are we doing this? It's like, well, we're all here, we're doing this. And there wasn't really a framework for how do we locate where this like digital virtual community in some real world context. And I did feel responsible for bridging that gap, yeah. Which made me very popular in my own Slack.
Lourdes, do you want to talk about what you were mentioning in the chat?
Has anyone heard the last podcast on the left? And it's all about like, it's a comedy podcast about murders and paranormal stuff and conspiracy theories. And so I don't know, I got really, on my drive from Boston to Texas, I listened to like all the episodes and I got really into it, and I joined the group on Facebook and I started posting a lot. And then all of a sudden, little did I know, I became a moderator. And it was a whole world. Like, so there was a group of mods and, we had our own group. So this was another extension group. And we had this chat, and the mods on purpose chose people from like different perspectives. So in the chat, there were these far right dudes that were really into guns. And then there was me, like far left lady of color who was totally like on them all the time. And, but, we like had this sense of camaraderie too. And even a group name for ourselves. It's so weird. But this was a job. This was like a couple hours a day. And it was, thousands of people were in this group that we modded. So, and so the reading about Facebook, the Facebook moderators, I mean, that's a whole other level. But there is some stuff that people posted and I saw, and I was just like, humanity, what is up with humanity? And why, like why are we unpaid group mods for this group? Like, why are we doing this? And what kind of
better if you were paid?
I think so. I mean, I guess the payment was like being friends with these people and being the cool mod and the cool group.
Oh, bye, Kevin.
Bye, Kevin.
Don, did you want to bring your chat into the conversation? There's not that many of us today. It's nice.
Yeah. I mean, first, just to acknowledge that was a lot of labor, Lourdes. And I don't, it's like it takes a lot and a lot of time, a lot of emotional energy. It kind of came up when I was thinking also about the Facebook article and even the Something Awful one, which is like, or also I guess the Something Awful one touched on YouTube. It wasn't discussed, but kind of in the background of my mind was that really great article by, I'm gonna forget his name, James Bridle, about like auto-generated content targeting children on YouTube, which is deeply creepy and disturbing. That came out a year and a half ago, maybe. And Lisa Nakamura wrote this like article and was kind of thinking through this thing, which she termed butch racism, which was like, we often see the kind of aberrant. We see these postings or like all of this like kind of hateful, misogynist, racist, and like just like deeply disturbing graphic content as aberrations. But what if we took that seriously as like an almost like an expected outcome? So like, let's not treat it as like an unintended consequence of what these platforms do, but like read them as like, no, this is one of their products. And like have that help think about how these spaces are built and maintained. Because I just don't actually know if I think that any of these models are sustainable when what they require is like, I guess I think what Facebook and YouTube and some of these big platforms are doing is basically trying to just throw as much cheap labor and people's like dignity at a problem and hope that they're going to get good enough at automating from what they learn from that at the cost of all of these people's like emotional well-being and see if that'll like, get them to a point where they expect that no one's going to have to look at it. But I just don't think that that's going to work if you build systems that like magnify or create it, where like virality is encouraged. And so it's not just that one video gets posted once, it's that like it gets posted hundreds of thousands of times and remixed and sort of like flows through multiple channels, Anyway, so I just felt like that was like a piece there, which wasn't explicitly addressed, but brought up in those articles. And then I like how Lisa Nakamura talks about it as a way to think about, I guess, like the design intentions.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking of like in junior high, everybody would share those videos, those GIFs that would just go on being peaceful and nothing for a long time, and then suddenly a scary face would pop out, and there was something so delightful about it to like every 12 and 13-year-old that would cause that to go viral, even though it was like kind of awful. And in response to what you were talking about with the YouTube generation of content that appeals to young children but is kind of horrifying to adults, my niece, whenever she got access to a phone for long enough, you'd look over and she'd just be like in that part of YouTube, and it's like weird stuff like adults or teenagers pretending to be babies, just really weird, like, I don't know, but something about how disturbing that is or how unusual that is. There's got to be something biological about how attractive that is to somebody very young. And I guess I wonder if that comes back to the question of responsibility to moderate, like, the existence of Something Awful is interesting by itself, right? Or of 4chan. Like, there is an audience that's explicitly looking for the sorts of things that, like, I, in my adult life, would like to be moderated out of my feed.
I have a couple of thoughts running in my head. And first of all, I'm thinking of the internet like when I was in middle school and just how completely unregulated it was. You find really, really messed up websites. I'm thinking of one website, I forgot the name of it, but it just has like graphic images. And this was I think this was like in 2001, 2002 during the war in Iraq. And it was just like images from the war and a lot of other gross things. And a lot of like really messed up stuff that's not moderated. but I don't know how. I think you really had to. I mean, it was like a 12-year-old stumbling upon it. It's pretty easy to get to. So this isn't a new issue, but what's new is the capitalism that is being that it perpetuates and is being perpetuated by it. Like now people make money off of this this content in a way. I mean, like these these companies that are contracting with Facebook and exploiting their workers. I mean, there's a whole industry made from this messed up content.
There, that end of the article about the, I'm just gonna forget the name. Sorry, it's been a week and it's only Tuesday. What's it called? Cognizant or whatever.
I'm thinking about.
Whatever the name of the company is. Yeah, Cognizant. Okay, but with a Z. Great. Just like the last line was, or one of the last lines was like pretty evocative about how like it's a system where they're like sold this dream of like maybe getting like the people who work there thought that they're like, this is like, oh, my first step into being like a knowledge worker working in a tech company. And then, but it's really like Facebook, like, or controlling costs and like risk by like outsourcing what they said, the messy work of finding and training human beings, laying them off all when the contract ends. Have the vendors hit some just at a reach metric and let them figure out how to get there. It's sort of like, yeah, in one way I agree, like it's nothing new, but there it does feel like there's a, like it's just such an acceleration of like existing patterns. Like that model of like outsourcing risk is very an old pattern. But it's like that when combined with this like sort of the scale that some of these platforms are operating at, sort of like this like fine tuning that's happening on them for certain behaviors or like types of attention, like that whole article on Facebook, Twitter's introduction of their new algorithm. Like they're all just like compounding into this like hyper or like acute state.
I wonder if there's been something fruitful we could look at in kind of the most profit-driven version of this, which is the articles on advertisements. I think that what's really interesting, just to get into the advertisements slightly, is like, unlike say the Facebook newsfeed or Twitter generally, we don't really have an expectation that advertisements should be equitable.
What do you mean by equitable?
Yeah.
I guess Facebook and Twitter feel to a lot of people like they're supposed to be a public forum, even though they're very literally not. But an advertisement, you know that that's because somebody paid for it to be there. And I think that there's a really interesting balance there. And I don't even have an article in this selection. I'm now realizing around like the ability to buy bots to promote your stuff as though they're people, or to buy people to promote your stuff as though they're individual people.
Yeah, I mean, Facebook conflates in its messaging on this stuff. It conflates the concept of freedom of speech in like multiple directions. It's like, you know, first of all, freedom of speech just means like the government can't arrest you, right? It has like there's the First Amendment does not apply to Facebook. Facebook can choose whatever policies it wants, right? So for them to say free speech is like not really coherent. And then yeah, like they hide behind free speech to defend their position on allowing deceptive political advertisements. But so I have some friends who've worked at Facebook for a very long time, like since the mid-aughts, like since the beginning. And I've argued with them about this stuff for a long time, and those arguments over the last 5 years have become like really, touchy. But it's worth at least understanding where they're coming from, right? They're like, from their perspective, they have this like pseudo sophisticated view of human nature as like A, yes, humans are flawed, and so like bad things are going to happen on Facebook, but B, like the marketplace of ideas is like inherently good, and so like though there are bad things that happen on net, freedom of speech is like people being able to say whatever they want is good, right? It's all going to work out in the end, and trying to like curtail freedom of speech, they're like, well, who gets to decide what's true, right? And from my perspective, I'm like, that's a really interesting question. It would be worth asking that question. Like, let's have that conversation, as opposed to it just being like, haha, hard question to answer, so therefore, like, end of story, right? But it is really worth thinking, and I don't know, like, I don't necessarily have ready answers as to, like, how should they decide what constitutes truth? It is hard, right? Like, I don't think it's as hard. I don't think it's as irreconcilable as they make it out to be. But I think their perspective is bad, and also we haven't had many opportunities to, or at least I would like to see other opportunities to demonstrate that there really is a coherent alternative to this sort of like civil libertarian, like, there's nothing we can do approach.
There's a really good book that is relevant to this conversation called Words That Wound. And it's about hate speech, especially in a university setting, and the fact, and it's in response to this whole libertarian idea that all speech should be free, with the argument that words actually do have, and like they can be violent. They have a physical impact, and especially when it's, a racist or homophobic slur or diatribe, it's can actually affect someone's livelihood.
I very nearly, but didn't quite, include an article in the reading list around the punching of Richard Spencer.
Yeah,
it was effective, right? Like for all that hand-wringing about punching fascists, like the fascists were like, every time we go into public, we get punched, so we're going to stop doing that now. I think, like, it seems like he doesn't go into public anymore, right? It was effective.
yeah.
Yeah, I would like to see a retrospective take on that, actually. It was really hot for a minute.
And it's like, if you're spewing violence, you're going to get violence in return. I'm sorry. It's like, at that point, it's defense to punch him because he's just such a violent character.
I guess I'm curious how platforms kind of play into this discussion of violence and public forums and freedom of speech. Like, do you think that if Facebook and Twitter didn't appear to be such big civic forums, do you think that we would like request one from the government, a digital space to discuss things?
So there are various governments that have attempted to create those sort of platforms, but they tend to be like in the era of, or like they kind of be like a capture for consent or resistance to like ideas. Like Canada is a very consultation heavy country, so like we get consulted a lot using like consultation platforms, and I think there's other countries that have models like that, like the CIDEM in what's at a different scale in Barcelona. I know Greece had sort of like a way that they were doing these online consultations, but like not necessarily in the sort of model of like a public fora that maybe Twitter operates at now and Facebook. But those places were not that in their original intent, right? Like one of the articles you posted shows that sort of shift in Twitter. And I think, the history of Facebook is also a history of shifting, and the way that Zuckerberg has reformulated their mission multiple times, I guess, like sort of reflects his changing thinking on what their goal is. I think now it's supposed to connect the entire world, right? So I don't the question about like, would people demand it? I don't know. I mean, I think that's like a different model of like how identities get like performed or like articulated at a nation level. Like probably not, because a lot of those are kind of like fictions anyway that are stitched together by a variety of forces. But I think that there have been like very powerful, like more regional like ways that there has been bottom up like wanting that kind of space. But I'm also like, I think to bring in here is like the nationalize efforts, right? Like the whole people who want to nationalize like some of these larger things, and or break them apart, or the activist stakeholders who basically want to buy out Twitter and make it a platform co-op. Like I think there's some interesting ideas circulating around converting those spaces.
Yeah, I mean, do you all have experience with the decentralized alternatives like Mastodon? Because I tried. It wasn't so much fun.
Oh wait, I did try. Yeah.
Wait, Greg, what was not fun for you?
I just like it wasn't actually clear how to do it. Like I managed to, after like half hour, I managed to like join a little group or whatever, like a node or an instance. I couldn't figure out how to see people on other nodes or how to communicate with them. It really, I believe deeply in the concept of federation, right, and decentralized networks and so on, but I couldn't figure it out. And so I suppose if you had a community that you like went there and built on, and and you like just made it work for a specific community, it seemed promising. But yeah, it was hard for me to imagine it catching hold.
I totally understand. I've been on Mastodon since I think 2015, and I have sub 100 followers there. And no one responds to anything I do, and I don't know anybody there. And I've like gone on conscious, like, when you get a Twitter, like when you make a new Twitter account, in order to get followers, you go out and you follow like 1,000 people. And on Mastodon, I tried to do that, and it was just like, I got nothing. This is so weird. But I wonder if that's what's powerful about Slack for people, as kind of like, you can have Twitter lists and other kind of sub communities and sub forums, but I was trying to think of like semi-decentralized, even though it's proprietary, platforms for creation of community, and I feel like that's been Slack for a lot of people, including some spaces. I'm in a space called WeAllJS, which is a Slack community for like explicitly inclusive for different identities who do JavaScript, and they have a bunch of kind of special moderation bots and rules where if you say something, if you say "you guys," for example, Slackbot will respond and correct your language.
Nice.
Which is something that Slack explicitly enables, is for you to set up that kind of interaction. I wonder if that's actually more decentralized than Mastodon, because you don't have to be a deeply committed decentralized technologist to use it.
I mean, with Mastodon, there's a really interesting, tension there, right? So I think there's been 2 waves of moves to Mastodon, which kind of like open up some questions around it. So Gab switched to using it like last summer in July. So the alt-right, far-right space for everyone who got deplatformed from Twitter went to build their, like, I guess, place where they could be white supremacists. Had a different underlying tech stack, and they switched to using Gab on they switched to using Mastodon servers, but like with sort of more selective rules about how to federate them. And that kind of spawned this whole like question, like crisis, or kind of just like question within the Mastodon community of like, do we want to federate these things? Like, but that came as a community to that space, right? And so I think that became rather self-contained and functional fairly quick to those people who were kind of, it was like an in-group that wanted in-group connections. There was another one more recently, I think beginning of this year, where there was a lot of censorship going on in India, and a bunch of journalists actually all made a move collectively to Mastodon at the same time, and we're like trying to think about censorship resistance and what these like federated and decentralized alternatives offer. So like I just think that poses some like, it opens up some of these questions around how moderation or like how content works, or when in these federated models, like what some of these questions mean when there isn't a universal view, unlike Twitter, where like, ostensibly I can access unless it's blocked, or I've blocked someone and they blocked me and I'm logged into the platform, blah, blah, blah. Like in many ways, I have a view that can be pretty like universal of like a whole platform space, but that is actually something you can definitely like play with in something like Mastodon. And if you come as a community, maybe it's a good community, or maybe it's a community that the existing Mastodon users don't want, like you can kind of choose, I think, how porous that boundary is in and out of you. I mean, this issue has come up as well with Scuttlebutt and SSB, right? So they had some pubs that were people were blocking, but the issue with how content is syndicated is people were worried that without them seeing it, they were still syndicating content from pubs that were like, I guess, kind of like anarcho-capitalist, libertarian, veering into kind of more right-wing, and I think some of the users or devices identities were doing like alt-right or white supremacist content. So there's like also that, I don't know, there's a lot of things there that I think are so interesting around moderation that these federated and peer-to-peer models open up.
A bit curious if folks here, so my partner is also very into the decentralized web, and so when we one-on-one chat, it is typically through Riot, which is by Matrix and decentralized, and even though it is significantly less reliable than our former platform, Facebook Messenger. And I've also like tried to get my family over onto Signal for our group messaging, partly because Signal is, better than using Facebook for a lot of reasons, but also partly because I just want it to work on my laptop, and I can't if they're not on it. And everyone but my sister, by the way, joined. I don't know why she won't. She doesn't know either. But I'm curious if you guys have made that kind of decision with your families or communities on which platform to be on, and why.
For a while, I was like, only message me and Signal, and but now I don't have a smartphone, so.
I did actually get my family on Slack a few years ago, which they resisted until they figured out how to embed animal GIFs. And it was like, they were so mad that I was like trying to get them to use this tool. And then like, once they saw that they could share GIFs, it was like everybody took to it, and there's like 30 channels and like great grandmothers in there.
Yeah, I mean, like I work with a lot of different people, and I kind of collaborate with a lot of people who are very value driven in how they work with technology. So I think these questions about like how far down our own stack or what are our tools that we use comes up a lot. So like in one organization, like our main space is and as a matrix, like I use Riot, so matrix chat. And it's always like a walking that trade-off of like proprietary versus like open and decentralized alternatives. And that is probably also true in my personal life. I have a lot of Signal groups, but also WhatsApp ones. And I'm just not on some platforms, like I don't have Facebook. But I think with all the mutual aid stuff going on right now, it's kind of been on my mind a lot more. So I started like a pod in my building, and we're using WhatsApp because it's like that perennial, I think, organizing problem of like you have to go where the people are, and I think that a lot of that model too is also one of harm reduction, not like puritanism. So it's like you can't be like, no, we'll only talk if you first install X new tools and like, you know, I don't know, air gap your machine to generate your key. So blah, blah, blah. Like, you know, like you gotta be like, okay, like let's like get working, but like let's start thinking actively about how to reduce risks to ourselves and what the risks we face as an individual or small group or community are. You know, I think you're seeing that right now with Zoom, like all of the stuff around the sort of the little misleading E. This is not end-to-end encrypted. Just saying. And or like privacy and some of those trade-offs. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's an active tension, right? It's not something to be resolved. I think it's probably just often something to negotiate.
And the other thing is WhatsApp is global. It's and it's integrated with our cell phone numbers. So, but then it's owned by Facebook. Yeah, so going with what you're saying, Donna, it's a whole tension that we have to face. But WhatsApp is pretty useful.
I had some interesting conversations with my mom around what gets communicated over different spaces. I was trying to convince her to try Scuttlebutt. I don't remember why. I don't, in retrospect, think it would work super well for her due to having no friends on Scuttlebutt. But she was talking about how on Facebook there's a lot of stuff that she just doesn't bother posting anymore, which I think is generally true for people, is once you get past a certain number of friends, you kind of don't want to post anything anymore. Or not anything like real or raw.
Yeah.
I guess I've been thinking about how we self-moderate on these platforms and how that kind of interplays with the moderation that's built into the platform, or how these platforms, I guess, nudge us to behave in certain ways towards each other.
I have a meme that I'm gonna find that addresses this question. Okay. Can't find the good meme, but this is. The one with 16 the 16 candles one.
Marina, you live
Oh,
in
yeah.
a wild and woolly world. Memes via Pinterest. What?
That's what I found in my Google Images search. So it has what's his face, Emilio Estevez's character is Twitter. Wait, what actor is that?
Ali Sheedy, Molly Ringwald.
Yeah, Molly Ringwald's Instagram, and then what's his face is LinkedIn. So, I mean, that's how I do. Like, my Instagram is I just have friends there, so I can let loose. And then my Facebook is like just everyone in my life, so I keep it pretty restrained unless I'm in my special private groups. Even though all my data's on there, but Yeah, it depends on the, like, there's we mold different platforms to different aspects of how we want to present ourselves to the outside world or to our audience. There's all this performativity in internet
I
life.
know. I'm trying to figure out a way to like frame this conversation around ways that we could take power over these spaces, and it's very difficult because I can't suggest anything, you know.
I mean, I think that's, again, I just am really interested. This is not my project, but were I in the mood to suggest research projects to people, I actually think revisiting what moderation means in some of these shifts in like peer-to-peer systems that authenticate identity per device as opposed to some other way that you verify it is quite interesting. So like, SSB, you generate a key pair, it's tied to a device, so you see people have multiple identities on SSB that are actually just like, this is my phone. And they'll say like, I don't do it, but it'd be like DC Walk laptop, DC Walk mobile or something. And that kind of like, it's like what gets identified with you or associated with you and what you is, when that changes, I think that really opens up how you want to think about some of these questions of moderation. And they actually have a really lovely, I don't know if any of you have read, I don't know if this was a previous reading topic, the principles that the Scuttlebutt community has defined, but they have this concept where they talk about mere moderation in the, I think right beside where they talk about interdependent abundance, which is also lovely. So yeah, like I think they're really trying to like get at opening up some of these topics from a very different angle that maybe like comes from like different architectural choices, but I think can speak back in cool ways too.
That's really interesting. That would have been a great reading. It reads as maybe directly coming out of influence from Enspiral, if you know them.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap there in terms of early people in Scuttlebutt and in Spiral. I mean, the other thing I would say is like a power take back mechanism, and this is, I have like a broken record today, sorry. That comes out of some of the mutual aid stuff is like just even visibility, right? Like I think people have flagged, like, when people are going and doing this more pod style or neighborhood level collaborating and working to each other, like those don't surface or get like brought up on this sort of like a single platform, but like the model that Facebook is perpetuating is this universal space. But I think that many scholars have like really very convincingly like critiqued that what's the problem is with like framing or designing for a universal. And I think that model doesn't work. So I feel like thinking about ideas like federation probably are better to represent like kind of like a more pluralistic approach to like a lot of different people all over the world connected rather than like a universal platform.
Wait, so what does federation mean?
I've been talking a lot. I can give an explanation, but I know, Greg, you said you're interested in it. So do you want to?
So, I mean, federation, as I understand it, is like you have a lot of different semi-autonomous systems that are a part of one system. And so one distinction that I think is really important, although sometimes I think these get fudged, is like the difference between federation and confederation. Like a confederation is like sort of like allies who aren't necessarily formally bound to each other, whereas federation is like actually we are members, we are bound by a specific set of rules. Sometimes that distinction, I think, when talking about networks is not always so clear. But yeah, like the United States is a federation of states. The states like have their own governing scopes and processes, but they also, you know, the federal government like sets some standards and does some things on their behalf, right, collectively. And so a federated network, sometimes it's not always clear to me whether a federated network is like, whether there is some sort of central organizing entity, or whether a federated network just means like there are different nodes that can communicate to each other using common protocols, but they're not necessarily actually like bound through some sort of central coordinating entity.
I'm just thinking of Star Wars.
Yeah. So, yeah, you mean like
Like
the imperial, like the empire versus the federation
yeah.
from like the first 3 episodes.
Yeah, like the what is it, like the Galactic Federation that they communicate with each other, but they usually stay out of each other's business unless it's to defeat the Empire, the big imperial force thing, whatever.
Yeah, I think Star Trek as well. Like Star Trek has a highly functioning federation.
Wait, is that the Galactic Federation?
No, that was Star Wars, but there's different federations depending on where you are in the Star Wars timeline.
Okay.
But I do think that's actually a really valuable point, especially like Greg, what you were talking about with not being sure in a decentralized technology context whether we really did mean federated in the sense of having some powers delegated to a like unifying authority. I think that's super interesting. I don't hear that discussed much.
I'm really interested in how Americans seem to have lost the capacity to understand the concept of federation. Like Americans do not understand this concept, and when you talk about federation, it makes them very uncomfortable, I find, which is so bizarre because like we were the first to really like do it. Not the very first, like the Native Americans actually did it before us, but like, you know, like that's the whole American idea, is that you have like local, state, federal, and we just don't really understand it culturally anymore.
Do you think it has to do with how we see subjectivity and shared values? Like, in my mind, a federation would be held together by shared values, but in the US, we're so into subjectivity and, you know, the idea that there's no universal morality, but it's like, dude, there is. You know, hurting other things and people is not moral.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's the shying away, just like with the freedom of speech thing, with color blindness, shying away from any sort of strong.
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, it's really interesting that you hone in on values there, because, so I study the commons, like the governing the commons, the whole field of common pool resource management that's like largely associated with Elinor Ostrom, the Bloomington School. And, you know, in the last 10 years, there's become like a subfield that focuses on knowledge commons and digital resources as commons, even though traditionally these are fields that study like watersheds and fisheries and woodsheds, you know, and like natural resource systems, but there are definitely some similarities. But the tricky thing is when it comes to digital commons, for about 10 years, I think the open source field had a lot of hype and sort of like tooted its own horn a lot, but got a lot of things wrong. I was finding that as an organizer who was like totally sold on the Here Comes Everybody, Yochai Benkler, like wealth and networks approach. And then once I started doing these projects, I'm like, this is all like, this doesn't work, right? And I was trying to figure out why. And when I started reading Ostrom's stuff, which is super technical and jargony and boring, and it's also like the most important stuff, she has a set of principles of like there are principles for the design of institutions that can sustainably share resources, right? Principle number 1 is boundaries. And And this was really tricky for like open source and open knowledge communities to wrap their heads around. Right? And when I was talking about Ostrom's work, like with like real anarchist hacker types, they just get immediately turned off by the notion of boundaries, because the whole idea is like a network is more valuable the more people are in it, and blah blah blah. So like, how would you set up boundaries? And I actually think that the key is to understand that the values set the boundaries.
Yeah.
Right. The values help a community determine like what's in, and therefore what actually must be. Even though this is an open network, blah blah blah, free speech, but like if you're not in line with these values, then you're out, and we have mechanisms to remove them. So yeah, I think
I'm
you're
resonating a lot with that.
What was that?
I'm resonating a lot with that, and I'm trying to figure out which part of that to discuss. One of the things that I see in open source, and I'm a lapsed maintainer of a open source project called Tessel that like is hardware which people are continuing to buy, but I think I might be the most active maintainer, which is not good. And there's this sense of responsibility that is hard, but then there's also this sort of sense of like we really did have this very embracing approach to maintainership, which is to say anyone could show up and say, hey, teach me how to use GitHub so that I can be a contributor, and we did like this sort of radical yes to that. But I would definitely not recommend that to your average open source project. And a lot of, I think I've talked about this with Rob within Edgy a bit, but like different open source projects have different meanings when they say open source, and it's okay. It has to be okay to say that, because a maintainer is not, well, first of all, a maintainer is typically not getting paid. It is not their job to A, make your feature, B, accept your pull request, C, listen to you talk about what you do and don't like about the thing they gave you for free. Open source can just mean I let you see it. Open source can mean I let you suggest things but not contribute. It can mean I let you contribute. It can even mean I help you contribute. But that distinction is frequently not made. And I think part of that has to do with it being still kind of a new field, but part of it also has to do with people coming in with too much idealism, and I say that with a cringe in my body, but boundaries matter a lot. If you can't make any, you don't have anything meaningful inside of them.
I'm thinking about the beginning of the internet stuff. Like, I'm sure people have read You Are Not a Gadget, that book by Jason Lanier or whatever. Yeah. And the whole idea, like before, that this was a sort of, wait, what was that, Kelsey? Oh, okay. That the internet was some sort of like anarchist idea or vision that then became co-opted by capitalism and by our ideas of what a computer interface should look like. Of like a group of people's idea of what a computer interface should look like is what people are now interacting with for now decades. Like the whole idea of a file folder, the fact that we store our information that way. And I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think like having no boundaries or a set of principles going in allows other principles to take over. And yeah, and that's I think that's how a lot of the technology we've built has become co-opted by systems of surveillance and advertising and capital.
I mean, I think with some of that stuff around early networks, there's also the historiography around how ARPANET and internet unfolded is like really gnarly, as something that I've been reading a lot about for my dissertation. But I think that there's also just a way that it unfolded that actually speaks to kind of it having an intentional flexibility that got kind of like recast in ways that were maybe unintended. And so I do think that there was sort of like an under definition of like certain values that allowed them to be kind of empty buckets that could be filled with a lot of discordant things, you know? So yeah, like I would kind of like maybe just add that layer in. And I think that that is like a hard problem, or that's a problem that I'm interested in, is sort of these projects that are very value driven that kind of still use these like flexible terms like decentralization, kind of like stands in for multiple different values. But it's sort of like thinking about how you pair that with other values that actually give shape or like a definition or like a trajectory to your work, or like actually speak to the types of social change that you're pursuing. Like that is what I'm kind of interested in.
My neck is getting so much better, just FYI.
Good.
Good to hear. Kelsey, I was just wondering, like I was thinking about when you were shaping these readings. I don't know, I guess I was wondering about how you were thinking about, like, I guess power and moderation and community, or if there's like another piece of that that it feels like we haven't touched on yet. Like, I don't know, just thinking about like how you maintain spaces at a much smaller level. Like there's a lot of like quote unquote moderation work that never counts as moderation work, which is actually just like maintaining social ties. And I guess that was like something that was in my mind, is like what is formally or has to formally be understood around moderation, and kind of what are these other ways that you talked about consent, or I think that's in the title, like if there's something you want to touch on with that.
Yeah. Actually, the one article we haven't really touched at all is human-centered design considered harmful.
Hell yeah.
And this is so interesting. I'm excited that there is an article about this. I was expecting to have to go and look for articles around how like notifications and badges and stuff draw from casinos. Are you familiar with this?
I didn't know that.
Like, there's addictive design patterns that are built into a lot of different apps and notification styles. And I think someone recommended this one in GitHub instead, maybe even you, Dawn, around human-centered design and how things that begin, I don't know, like I'm seeing the broader pattern of things that begin with these really genuine intentions, like the creation of a community that needs to talk to each other, can turn into these crazy things when with these other interest influences and, you know, people, when people get involved, it gets messy. But also when money gets involved, it gets warped in this weird way. What did you guys get out of this post?
Yeah, I've been waiting for an article like that for a long time. I find the user-centered design discourse maddening. Like, which isn't to say like it can't be useful as a tactic for a certain phase of a process, but like, it seems to have been a huge miseducation for an entire generation of would-be do-gooders to just like be like, well, we just have to think about like who the specific user is and how do we design for for them. And it just involves all this whole process of simplification, which I understand like the objective of that process, but when you're dealing with things like infrastructure and complex systems, that process of simplification is a process of like erasure. And it's eventually going to come back to bite you in the ass. If you're probably going to fail, or if you succeed, you're going to end up becoming a part of somebody else's problem by like just starting with human-centered design principles. I just shared this set of principles that I found last month, society-centered design principles, which may be a helpful corrective. Although I really only read through it once, but I was like, yeah, this is what, what I want to see in the world.
I just received Sasha Costanza-Chock's book, Design Justice.
Awesome.
And I started reading it. And I think their argument is right on point, and we've been drawing a lot from it in EDGI with the Environmental Data Justice Group, that design really needs to happen from the bottom up instead of top down and through capital surveillance.
Yep.
But what also resonated me was this argument about anthropocentrism, that this quote human-centered design is anthropocentric and ignores everything else in the world. It reminded me of this geographer, I forgot who it was, that writes about it's a jumble in my head, I can't really articulate it, but like turns our ideas of anthropocentrism on its head and critiques like the whole mainstream environmental movement as anthropocentric, because it's like with ecological systems, it's saying, oh, we need to take care of the wild and of the wilderness because we're humans and we need to survive, instead of looking at environmental justice issues, which is not anthropocentric, it's more society-centric. I'm going on a tangent, but I think what's weaving these together is this idea of a collective, moving towards collective-oriented design and thought instead of in decisions, as opposed to individual and alienated decisions that will destroy the world.
Yeah, there's been some really good kind of critiques of user-centered design, or kind of that very like, I think this is like a lot of design scholars would also kind of like more broadly than sort of these narrow terms like human-centered, user-centered, would just like speak to in design, especially kind of coming out of those roots of industrial design, like an operationalizing tendency, which kind of like turns focus to product and then like thinks about an individual engagement with the product is like the site to design for. Like, I don't know, there's like that famous Papanek Design for the Real World book. It's like an early hot take, which is pretty fun. And I think some of it is like also you just see in the way theory or ideas around design get like developed. Like I think Don Norman as like this seminal figure in design thinking in that sort of space, like kind of took a theory from psychology, like affordances, which was like about a relational approach, ecological psychology, I guess. And then like kind of like narrowed it down to this narrow way you think about like an individual like perceiving or like seeing these affordances in an object. So I think there's just this like tendency that I actually don't know if we're like at a good point to like unwind, but there's a lot of really cool, I think, ways in where people are trying to challenge that. And thinking about, say, like Sasha Costanza-Chock's work and sort of design justice and that very like participatory approach, like there's that kind of lineage of like participatory design and like workplace studies stuff, which was like super rad starting in the 60s and 70s. I think this is really hard. Like this to me is like a thing where there's a lot of people kind of coming at it, but there aren't ways through yet that I think are reproducible. Like there are these micro moments, but I don't know if we've sort of like escaped the like gravity well that is getting trapped in like designing a specific product and then starting to like when you just have to like design a thing, you just fall back on those patterns. I don't know. I've found myself doing that when I do project management work. You're like, okay, let's write user stories. Let's write personas. Like you just start like doing that thing just because you need to like move forward.
That's definitely something we've talked about before in these discussions, is that sense of a need for momentum. And we know that we need them. We know we need it to stay motivated at things, but it can be the most harmful thing we do is like make progress intentionally. On the other hand, I get really frustrated with these, like the bottom-up design question and the decentralization question. Like we can say that it's good theory all we want, but how do you deploy a thing like that without starting at the top, I guess?
Translocal, non-hierarchical distribution. That's it. That's the way. No, I actually think there are like, again, the glimmers of like really cool processes around that, right? Like, but yeah, they don't scale because scale is like a part of the problem or it's like there's like a tension in that not resolved. I was also going to say, I said in the chat, so the Toronto node of the Design Justice Network is starting to do a read along of the book. I think we're doing like a chapter meeting. Garance Edgy, known to you all in Edgy, is I think kind of leading it with Victoria, who's an old Design Justice Network person. There's like a crew in Toronto, and it's all online now, obviously, like because of the moment we're in, so easily joinable. And part of what some of the design justice people are doing, which I think is cool, is like actually doing this like reflective process of projects they work on, like and like kind of like applying or thinking through the design justice principles, and kind of doing like a retrospective. So I feel like that is a nice model for trying to like notice that lag and do like a resyncing work, or kind of like trying to weave back principles and practice.
When do you meet?
It's like, I think it's Tuesdays or maybe Thursdays. I'll send it in the chat, and I can send it out over the mailing list.